So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Heather Bacher. I'm the state coordinator for Indiana for the Women for the Land initiative. We're the host today for the discussion. Women for the Land provides programs for Hoosier women to learn about and access conservation information and resources. So we've recently begun to offer these virtual programs via the Zoom platform. So I think many of you have been with us before. Some of you may be new, and if you are, welcome. If you have any questions during the presentation, please share those in the chat box. And at various times, Mitch will stop and ask for questions, and I will share those with him. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Mitchell Ziske to begin the program.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks everybody for showing up today and for having me at this forum. This is a great forum. This is the third presentation in the series, and I've had a lot of fun doing these so far. And my passion is fish biology, so we're going to really have some great discussion today. I'm looking forward to it. Let me share my screen here, and we'll get started. Okay, so for those who haven't been on either of the last two sessions, my name is Mitchell Ziske. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue, and I have an extension appointment. So I do a lot of extension in fish and wildlife and fisheries and pond management and stuff like that. And so here's some information about me, and you can check out our website or contact me via email if you have specific questions. This is the series that we have going here with the Women for the Land program. And today we're talking about fish stocking and fish harvest. And we're going to also talk a little bit about fish assessment. And then next week, we're going to finish up by talking about aquatic vegetation and how to identify plants and how to manage plants. And I know I get a lot of questions about plants. And so hopefully that'll be a pretty interesting session next week as well. But the goal for today is to really provide some practical guidelines around fish. So for those who are looking to stock fish, what fish should you stock? How many should you stock? When should you stock them? And stuff like that. Talk a little bit about assessing fish and some of the measurements and the data that we can collect for fish assessment. And then also talk about harvest, why harvest is important, and how we can use harvest to sort of control and manage the fish populations that we have. And so that's sort of the plan for today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some of the fish we might like to stock in ponds and just provide a bit of an overview of their biology and ecology. This is often interesting for you if you have these fish in your ponds, and it can also help us understand how to manage their populations. Then we'll talk about stocking fish, assessing fish, and then how we manage fish through harvest and how we can actually use harvest to fix a lot of common problems with fish populations. The information I'm going to have in this presentation today is really underpinned by a few publications that we have now at Purdue. And you can, I think Heather shared these, and you can get these via our website. But we have a publication on stocking fish, so which fish to stock, which fish not to stock, when to stock them, how to stock them, and in particular, the numbers that you might like to stock and the sizes that you stock. We also have a document, I mentioned this document last week, about how to manage fish populations. What are some of the things to consider? How do we assess them? What are some of the different management scenarios we might have? And then we also have a field guide for helping you identify the fish that you have in your pond. So this is a waterproof 6x4 field guide. And these go through about 20 or 30 of the more common species you might find in your pond, and it can help you identify the fish that you have in there, and hopefully, identify whether they're a desirable fish or maybe an undesirable fish that you might look to try and get rid of. Okay, so I want to start by just talking about some of the common fish that we see in ponds. And if you have a pond or you've spent a lot of time around ponds, you'll probably know a lot of these. So these are really the four of the most common fish that we see in ponds, and really some of the most common fish that we recommend for stocking in ponds. And so we have two species of sunfish here. This is bluegill and this is a red ear sunfish. These guys are called red ear because they get this little red tip on their ear or their gill plate there. And in a pond, both of these are really considered the prey fish in the pond. We like to catch them and we like to eat them as well, but they really form the that prey base for some of our larger fish in the pond to eat. Most ponds in the Midwest, the predominant predator in the ponds are largemouth bass. These are things that we like to catch. They're good to eat, and they form, they represent the predator in the pond. So the bass are eating the bluegill and the sunfish, and the sunfish and bluegill are providing food for the bass. And this predator-prey relationship is really important for managing fish in our ponds, and I'll talk about that in more detail today. And then the fourth species that we see quite a lot are are channel catfish. And I consider these more of an innocent bystander in the pond. Yes, they will prey on bluegill and red ear a little bit, although not enough to sort of control their populations. They will eat some dead fish. So if any of these other fish die, the catfish will eat them. Largemouth bass will eat small catfish, but once again, it's not really an important part of that predator-prey relationship. And so really they just exist in the pond. They help clean up the pond a little bit, and they can provide a great opportunity for some diversity in your pond, some different fish to catch, and some great fish to eat as well. And so what I want to do for these four common species, I want to just step through some of their biology, if you're not familiar with some aspects of their biology, because these can sort of help us manage them, but it also can just give us some information about what we're seeing in our pond throughout the year. And so bluegill, they really eat a lot of insects. They'll eat small crayfish and snails. They'll also eat eggs. So a lot of bluegill will eat bass eggs when the bass build their nests. And so bass will often chase them out of the nest so they don't eat the eggs. But one of their key roles in the pond, like I said, is they provide food for largemouth bass. When we stock bluegill in a pond, you'll usually see them to start spawning within about a year. In some of our ponds at Purdue, we stock some of them in the we'll stock some of them in the spring, and they'll actually be spawning later that summer, depending on what size you stock them at. So they usually grow pretty quick, and they start reproducing pretty quickly. The way that bluegill reproduce is that they build these circular beds. You can see them here, and they typically build them in a cluster. And then for each one of these circles, you'll have a male. A male will go in and build the nest. They'll mate with a female, and then the male actually stays in that nest and protects the eggs and protects the juvenile fish when they hatch. And so each of these circles would represent a male and a nest, and they form these colonial or these clusters of nests. They produce a lot of eggs, so a female can lay up to 50,000 eggs a year. And so because of that, they can easily overpopulate a pond. And so if you have a pond with bluegill in there and you don't have sufficient predation by bass or other fish, what will happen is you get lots and lots and lots of bluegill, but they don't grow very big because there are just too many of them in that pond. And we'll talk about some of those issues later. In a well-balanced pond, bluegill can grow to at least 10 inches in size, and they can reach 6, 7, or 8 years old. But most of the bluegill in your population will be smaller and younger than this. So this is just an example, probably of like a 2-year-old bluegill. It's you can see it's probably about 5 or 6 inches long, and this is sort of the size, maybe a little larger than this, is when we're going to start thinking about harvesting them to eat. So red ear sunfish are very closely related to bluegill. They're part of the same family of fishes, and so they eat many of the same things. Red ear really like to eat snails, and they're sometimes called shell crackers because they eat so many snails. And so if you have really heavy snail populations in your pond, red ear can be a great way to get rid of some of those snails. And this is important because a lot of those snails serve as like a vector for parasites. And so these red ear can reduce the snail populations and help keep some of those parasites in check. Not that parasites are often a problem in ponds, but if you do have a parasite problem, then you might look to put red ear in to help with that. Once again, they provide food for largemouth bass. They typically grow a little slower than bluegill, and they reproduce a little later. And so that it might take them 2 to 3 years after they've first stocked for them to start spawning. And they can grow larger than bluegill. So you can get red ear sunfish up to 15 inches, a couple of pounds, and they grow a little older than bluegill as well. So, for those that are looking for a diverse fishery, it's really great to have both bluegill and red ear in your pond because they both provide food for bass, and they provide different opportunities for fishing, and these red ear can get quite a bit larger. Largemouth bass, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these guys. They're the major predator we have in ponds. They eat bluegill and red ear sunfish. They eat minnows if there are minnows in the pond. They eat crayfish. When they're smaller, they eat invertebrates like insects and worms and stuff like that. And they'll also eat other bass. Larger bass will commonly eat small bass as well. They typically take 2 to 3 years after you stock them to start spawning. They typically need to get to about 10 to 12 inches in size for them to start reproducing. They spawn in the spring, so they spawn before sunfish. So typically in the May, June, when the water's a little over 60, 65 degrees, that's when they start spawning. And they build nests just like sunfish do, but they only do these in solitary nests. They don't sort of have a big cluster of nests like bluegill or red ear do. But the male builds a nest, attracts a female to that nest. The female lays the eggs, and then the male will guard the eggs and guard the fry for up to 10 days in that nest. And bass, they can grow really large, and pond environments can actually be a really great opportunity to grow some large bass. The state record in Indiana is a little over 14 pounds, which is a huge bass, and that actually came from a large pond or a small lake in Indiana. So if you have a pond, an acre, a couple acres in size, it's a great opportunity to grow some really nice sized bass. And the last fish I want to talk about are channel catfish. And so they, like I said, they eat a lot of dead organisms on the bottom. They eat dead fish. They help clean up the pond. They also eat live fish if they can catch them. They eat crayfish. They eat a lot of insects. And catfish can also grow quite large in ponds. In some cases, they can grow up to 20 pounds. Although commonly, you can get a bunch of catfish in your pond that are 2, 4, 5 pounds in size. They spawn the latest out of all of these fish. They spawn in June, July when the water is at least 75 degrees. And rather than building nests like the other fish do, they actually spawn in hollow logs or other dark places. So if you're interested in having catfish populations in your pond, you want to help them spawn, one of the ways that you can do this is by putting a lot of logs or even things like barrels in your pond. It provides them a nice sheltered place for them to spawn. One interesting fact about channel catfish is when their fry hatch from the eggs, they actually form these really tight schools, these like clusters. It's actually pretty cool if you've ever seen these in a pond. You can see these black sort of clusters of little fry swimming around. The problem with this is that it makes them really easy to eat, and so bass can go in and basically eat the whole little ball of fry in one go. And so often if you have channel catfish in a pond that you've also got bass in, the predation by bass on these fry can really restrict how successful their spawning is. And so because of that, you often need to restock catfish every 3 to 5 years to help sort of bump up that population. And if that's a little bit about the fish biology, and you can add habitat to help out with their spawning and help out with their biology. And so both sunfish and bass for that matter like spawning on gravelly or sandy sort of substrate. And so if you're interested in trying to promote sunfish spawning or bass spawning, you can add sections of sand or pea gravel or even riprap to your pond, and that can help promote their reproduction. Here you can see some people have built these little nesting boxes, which is essentially just some gravel in the bottom of a bucket so that the bass can go in and build their nest on top of this. You don't really need to do this. If you want, you can just put in some gravelly areas and they'll make their nests on those. This is an example of a barrel for catfish. You can see it's like a nicely enclosed barrel with a cinder block on the bottom. Other things that I've seen used for catfish spawning are PVC pipes. And so if you have a PVC pipe, you know, about 8 inches in size, maybe up to 12 inches in size, that the catfish will use those for spawning as well. And you can even put a cap on one of those ends to help make them more enclosed and more protective. So these two, you know, when you're adding fish habitat, when you add things that help reproduction and spawning, you can actually increase the populations in your pond because their spawning becomes more successful. Other types of habitat are less about sort of increasing production or increasing the number of fish, and more about providing those fish some shelter and maybe aggregating those fish together. And so you can put old trees in your pond, you can put wooden stake beds like this here, and fish will aggregate around these. And if you have a larger pond, this can be really useful to sort of help aggregate those fish together so you can sort of fish in those areas and have a better success rate when you're fishing. You know, often, as you might expect, trees and wooden stakes are pretty good at catching fish hooks and lures as well. And so a lot of people will use like pieces of PVC because then their lures and their hooks slide over them rather than getting stuck in them. But you know, these can be a great place to provide some extra habitat for fish, particularly if you don't have much existing habitat in your pond. You can add some of these things in to provide some habitat. I will just mention it here too. I don't think I talk about it anywhere else today, but the number one type of habitat for fish is vegetation. So if you're interested in growing good fish in your pond, then you really need some good vegetation in your pond. You don't want to be sort of killing all your vegetation off. And the best vegetation really is the stuff that's in the water. So submerged pond weeds, lily pads and stems are good. And that vegetation provides them shelter. It provides them food. So, you know, they have a lot of insects around them, which the bluegill can eat. And then the bass can go in there and eat the bluegill. And they also help shade and regulate temperature in your pond. So aquatic vegetation is really the best habitat that you can have for fish. I guess I'll just stop there and see if there are any questions about the fish biology stuff before I get into talking about some of the fish stocking options. So yeah, are there any questions about general sort of fish biology?
I'm not seeing any questions particularly, Mitch. Jessica mentions fish habitat goes a long way in mitigating depredation of fish from ponds from other native wildlife as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. You know, often people are concerned that things like otters or you know, great blue herons and stuff like that will be eating some of their fish. And so if you have some of this vegetation or woody debris, you know, trees, stuff like that, that provides fish a great opportunity to hide from some of these other predators. Okay, well, I'll keep going then. And so what I wanted to do, so I mentioned that there are those 4 species that we commonly recommend for people to stock into their ponds. There are some other fish that you might consider in some circumstances. And so the first I wanted to talk about are minnows. And so a lot of people are interested in stocking minnows into their ponds to provide food for bass. If you want to do this, the species that we recommend are fathead minnows. That you can get these pretty much at most fish hatcheries. These are really great because they don't grow too large. Some of the other minnow species you get can actually grow too large for bass to eat, and then they start to sort of crowd and crowd out your pond and become overabundant and cause problems. But fathead minnows really don't grow much larger than about 3 or 4 inches. And so, you know, even the largest fathead minnows will be able to be eaten by most of the bass. The best way to use minnows, in my opinion, is to, if you have a new pond or a renovated pond, or even a pond that you've got with maybe some other things in it, but you don't have any bass or anything in it, minnows can be a great way to sort of kickstart growth in your pond. And so what you might do, say you've got a new pond, say it, you know, you've dug it in the summer, it started to get a little bit of algae and vegetation in there. You might put some minnows in there, you know, in the summer or the fall, and then you might wait until next spring to then put some bass in there, and then there'll be a food source for those bass as soon as they get in, and that can help kickstart their growth. if you put these minnows in a pond with bass already, or once you add bass into that pond, these minnows are typically going to get gobbled up pretty quickly. They don't tend to reproduce very well in ponds, and they're pretty easy for bass to catch. And so if you are looking to stock minnows as an ongoing food source, that can really start to get expensive, because basically you might be buying 20 pounds of minnows, you put them in your pond, and then within a week or two they're all eaten. And then so you're really just buying really expensive fish food. And the other thing to think about too is the predation between bass and bluegill is really important for keeping both of those populations in balance. And if you start putting other things in there that the bass can eat, they then won't eat bluegill, and then you've got the potential for those bluegill to sort of get out of control and start to become crowded in your pond. But apart from that, minnows are great if you're looking to kickstart a pond, and they can provide some really great food for bass to encourage that early growth. The two other fish that you might consider stocking both relate to using them to control vegetation. And so we'll talk about these more next week, but you could stock triploid grass carp if you're interested in using them to control pond weeds. So these grass carp predominantly eat pond weeds, coontail, things like that are growing on the bottom of the pond. They don't eat algae very much. They don't eat duckweed. They don't eat plants like cattails. But they can do a pretty good job at controlling pond weeds in some, in some situations. So you can use those, you can stock those in there. And if you do stock those in there, you may need to restock them every 5 or 7 years to make sure that they're doing a good job. Once they get old and big, they actually start to eat a lot less vegetation, and they don't actually do the job that you want them to do. And tilapia, you may have seen in restaurants and grocery stores, but tilapia actually eat algae. And so they can be really good at controlling algae, the filamentous algae, the floating algae that you might get in your pond. They don't really eat much pondweed or duckweeds or stuff like that. The thing about tilapia is they die when the water gets cold. And so basically they're an annual sort of crop if you want to put them in your pond. So you need to stock them in the spring. Through spring, summer, and fall, they're going around eating your algae. They actually grow quite fast. And so if you stock them in at, let's say, 1/4 pound, by the end of the summer, they could be 3 or 4 pounds already. So they can grow really fast. But once the water drops below about 55 degrees, they'll start dying. And so you need to try and get them out before this happens, because if they all die in your pond, they're going to add a lot of nutrients and probably make your algae problems worse next year. You can catch them on a rod and reel with, a lot of people catch them on flies. Or one thing that you can do is when the water starts to get cold, they start to get really lethargic and they push up into the shallow areas where it's warm, and they start to get pretty easy to sort of catch with a net. And so, it can be a great option to grow fish and then to harvest those fish for food and to help control your algae, but you do need to put in some effort to get those out in the fall. And so I want to just talk about a few other fish species that I get questions about sometimes, but actually can cause problems in ponds. So the first group of fishes I want to talk about are bullheads. So bullheads, some of you may have seen bullheads in your ponds. They're a type of catfish, and they're not really desirable because they don't grow very large. They only grow to about 12 inches in size. They're not, great for eating or great for catching. And so really, if you've got these in your pond, they're going to, they feed on the bottom, so they make your water really muddy. They can prevent plants growing, and they can really have a negative impact on your whole pond and your whole fish population. To give you an example of the sort of impact this can have, I've been working with the Columbian Park in Lafayette to help them with their pond renovation. They have like I forget how big it is now. It's a couple acres. But they basically did this big pond renovation where they emptied it out, they dug all the silt out, and they're making it look really nice. And when they drained their pond, it hadn't really been managed in a long time. They had like 99% of the fish in that pond were these bullheads. And so once these bullheads had gotten in, they made it muddy, they prevented the plants from growing, and they basically caused all the other fish to disappear. So these can be a real problem. And if you do have them in your pond, I'd suggest trying to get rid of them. It can be tricky to get rid of fish once they're in there, but if you do see them, you can just remove them as you see them and hopefully have some impact on getting rid of them. But definitely, if you are looking to stocking fish in your pond, and you think, well, I'll just go down the creek and get some fish, you know, that's often how these get brought into ponds. And so I definitely recommend against doing that. Often people ask me about perch and crappie. So yellow perch and black and white crappie are very popular sports fish. People catch them in rivers, in reservoirs, in natural lakes. And a lot of people want to have them in their ponds. And they can do okay in ponds. If you have a large pond, say greater than 5 acres in size, you can actually establish pretty good crappie populations that don't have a negative impact on the other fish. If you've got a deeper, cooler pond, you might be able to establish some yellow perch in there as well. But for most people who have ponds smaller than 5 acres in size, often when you put these fish in there, they just outcompete some of your other more desirable fishes. And so both of these fish have larger mouths than bluegill do. And so they can outcompete bluegill. They also predate directly on bluegill. So they can crash your bluegill populations, but then they also grow larger than bluegill. And so it can be tricky for bass to eat them. And so basically you end up with a bluegill population that's been outcompeted, a bass population that doesn't have any food, and then you end up with a perch or a crappie population that just becomes crowded, overabundant, and you end up with lots and lots of small fish, and it's not a really great situation. And then another problem fish that you've probably heard of before, and it comes as no surprise that you don't want them in your pond, but these are common carp. You'll often see them in rivers and reservoirs. You really don't want these in your pond at all. They don't help with vegetation. All they do is feed on the bottom. They muddy up a pond. They compete for space and with your other fish, and they can destroy a lot of your vegetation and a lot of your good habitat. So you want to avoid those. There are a bunch of other fish that can cause problems in ponds, but these are really just a snapshot of some of the common fish that we see showing up in ponds. And if you do end up with these problem fish, it can be really tricky to get rid of them. And it may actually require you sort of draining the pond and starting again, because, you know, you might try and remove, you know, dozens of these fish a year, but if they're reproducing faster than you can remove them, and then it becomes very tricky to get rid of them. Yep, did we have a question?
Yes, I'm sorry, Mitch. Sarah's asking, how do we ID the different species of catfish? What are the distinguishing features?
Yeah, so we have, why don't I pull up the fish ID guide, because that has it talks about catfish. Okay. Okay, so this is the catfish and the bullhead page from our fish ID guide. And so basically it has channel catfish here, which is the one that we want in ponds. It has blue catfish and flathead catfish. These are often large catfish that we find in rivers, and some people might think, well, they're in rivers, so we want to maybe put them in our ponds, but they really grow too large to be viable in ponds. And then these are the bullheads. And in this case, we just talk about bullheads in general. But this shows some of the distinguishing characteristics. One of the keys for bullheads versus, say, channel catfish is that channel catfish, their whiskers, they have 4 whiskers or 4 barbels on the top of their head, which are generally the same color as their body. And then the 4 they have on their chin are white. Whereas if you look at bullheads, they have 4 whiskers on the top and 4 whiskers on the bottom, but these will just all be black. They won't have white ones on their chin. So that's one of the ways that you can tell them apart. Then another one is that the bullheads have a flat tail, whereas the channel catfish have a forked tail. And then there are other ways here that you can count the number of fin rays on their fins. And so you can see that bullheads tend to have a pretty short anal fin here, whereas the channel catfish has a longer one with more fins. So there are a couple of examples. If you go to the website and download this guide, we also have a description here that tells you a little bit about each of them, how to identify between them.
Very helpful.
Okay, So the next thing I want to talk about now is stocking fish in your pond. So I've given you a bit of an idea about some of the good species, some of the bad species, and a little bit about their biology. But how do we go about stocking fish in a pond? Is it as easy as just going to buy some and throwing them in there? And what sizes do I buy? How many do I buy? That sort of thing. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. And so I just want to say that in most situations, you really only need to stock fish in a new pond or a renovated pond. Or if you've had a really large fish kill and there's not very many fish left, they're really the only situations you should be considering stocking fish. If you have an existing pond and you have fish in there and the fish are just not growing well or are not the size you want, if you stock new fish into that pond, you're just going to make the problem worse. And so stocking is really only for establishing fish. It's not for fixing problems with your existing fish. And typically when we stock fish into a pond, we generally start with what we call fingerlings. So pretty small fish here. This is a small bluegill that's about 2 inches. And this is a small bass that looks to be maybe about 4 inches. And typically starting with these small fish are great because they're cheaper. But also if you stock both these bass and these bluegill together when they're small, what happens is they grow together in that pond and they sort of create a balanced environment with each other. If you put small bluegill in, but then you put bass that are 8-10 inches in there, what will happen is those bass will eat all these small bluegill before they get a chance to grow. Conversely, if you put small bass in but large bluegill, then these small bass may not have any small fish to eat and they may run out of food. And so if you're looking at stocking a new pond, it's great if you can get these small fingerlings together and put them in at the same time. And like I said, this supplemental stocking, this idea that you need to put fish in your pond once it's already established, you typically don't need to do this unless you've got a major fish kill, unless you need to kill off your pond because of a problem species and things like that. And so, if you have some fish problems and you are wondering about stocking, then definitely send me an email and I can help guide you through some of those questions. So if you, you can get fish from fish hatcheries. It's always good if you're thinking about stocking fish to call them pretty early in the season to get on a wait list or to see what they have available and what sizes they have. Typically, if you go and pick up fish, you'll get them in bags like this. These bags will have air or often oxygen pumped into them so the fish can survive in these bags for a little while. If you have a really big order, you might be able to, they might deliver the fish to you in a big tank like this. Other times, if you don't have a hatchery near you, you can reach out to your local sort of feed or supply store, and they might do like bulk orders where they take orders from a dozen people, and then the fish hatchery brings a truck out and you can pick your fish up locally. So the key when stocking fish is you want to minimize their stress, because if you've paid for these fish, they're small, they're pretty vulnerable. So you don't want to stress them out and have half or more of them die. And so there are a few things that you can do to minimize their stress. The first thing is once you've got them is to get them over to the pond pretty quickly. You don't want to go pick up your fish from the hatchery in the morning, then go and have lunch somewhere and go watch a movie and then eventually bring the fish in the afternoon. You want to try and get them back to your pond pretty quickly. They will survive in these bags for a couple of hours or more, but you definitely want to try and minimize that time that they're in these bags. It's great to be able to stock them when the weather is cool. So spring and fall is a great time to stock fish because the weather is cool, the water is cooler, and cooler water, not only is it less stressful, but it also has more oxygen in it. And so it really provides a nice environment for these fish going into a pond. If you do have to stock in the summer because that's when the fish are available, then try and do it in the evening, or if you can, pick a cooler day. If you've got a shady part of the pond with trees overhanging it, maybe go there in the evening and stock that, or even early in the morning, that when the pond's been cooling overnight. So try and pick some of those cooler times of the day. And so what you want to do when we stock fish is we want to acclimate the fish to the pond. And so we want to acclimate them both to the temperature of the water and also to the sort of chemistry of the water, because there's a good chance that the water they're in from the hatchery is a lot different to the water that's in your pond. And so to acclimate them to the temperature, the best thing to do is you get these bags and you just go and sit them in the pond water. And then over the space of about 30 minutes, that pond water will typically heat up the water in the bag so that those temperatures become the same. Well, once you've done that, you also want to try and acclimate them to the chemistry of the water. And so after that first 30 minutes, then what you might do is open the bags up. You might scoop a bucket or two of pond water in there, and then close the bag back up for 10 minutes, open it again, put a couple more scoops of pond water in there. And you might do this over the space of another 30 minutes. And so that is just slowly introducing that pond water and getting them used to the chemistry of that pond water. So this whole process may take an hour or more, where you get them used to the temperature, you get them used to the chemistry, and then once these bags are a half, 3/4 full of water because you've been adding pond water to it, then they're ready to release. And when you release them, you just want to open the bag, slowly put that bag down into the water and allow them to sort of swim out of that bag naturally. You don't want to sort of just dump them out. If you've got fish coming in from a truck and you've got them in a tank here, then typically the way we do it is we'll pump water into that tank. And so we might get a hose or a pump or something, and we can pump water into that tank. And over the space of 30 minutes, we sort of fill that tank up with pond water, and that helps them acclimate to the temperature and to the chemistry. And I want to reiterate here that if you are looking to put fish in your pond, don't be tempted to go out and collect your own fish. You might think, well, I can go get fish from my local creek, or my neighbor down the road has some fish he can give me. But there are lots of bad things that can happen from this, because even if you're pretty confident that you're getting bluegill or bass or red ear, you may be introducing disease into your pond that you don't want to do. But if you're going out and collecting fish, there are probably 8 or 10 species of sunfish in streams. There are lots of different types of minnows. And you might be putting in species that end up not being desirable in your pond. And like I said earlier, often to fix this, you need to drain the pond. And so it really is best to get these fish from a hatchery, and so that you know that you're starting with the right fish for your pond. And so if you're looking to stock fish, all of these numbers are in our publications, but I want to just to touch on them here. So these are the numbers that we recommend stocking per acre when you're stocking a new pond. And so we recommend stocking 1,000 bluegill per acre. And if you want some red ear, basically what you do is you just substitute bluegill for red ear. So say you want an equal number of each, then you would do 500 bluegill, 500 red ear. But we want to have about 1,000 of these sunfish per acre. And then we recommend stocking 200 bass per acre. And these are if you can get fingerling sizes of 1 to 3 inches. And then, when you put these, when you get these fish, they'll be in a bag, and you'll think, well, this is a small amount of fish for my 1 acre pond. But that means that they've got lots of resources, that they can grow fast, and they can do really well. And within a year or two, you'll really start to see some good sizes and some really good fish populations. The other thing to remember too is that these fish will reproduce a lot, and so you don't want to fill up your pond from the get-go, because then there's no room for the new fish to come along and use. The key with stocking bass and bluegill is we recommend keeping them in about a 5-to-1 ratio, so 5 bluegill to 1 bass, and this really provides bass with enough food and also enough predators to sort of help keep those populations in check. If you do want to put catfish in as well, then we also recommend about 200 fish per acre at that sort of 3-inch size. And so, if you have a pond that you've established for 6 months or something, and you've got some good algae, some good vegetation in there, and you're looking to do a stocking all at once, you could stock these 3 fish all at once together, and then they'll sort of grow together in a pretty balanced pond. If you're looking to restock fish, so for whatever reason you might need to restock, you've had a fish kill, but you know that there are some fish still there. Maybe you need to restock catfish because it's been a few years and they haven't had very good reproduction. You can follow the same sort of approach to stocking. The only difference is you typically want to stock larger fish. If you know that you've got some fish already in your pond, then the fish you put in there, you want them to be larger so that they have a better opportunity to compete against those that are already there. So for bluegill, this might mean fish 2, 3, 4 inches in size. For bass, it might mean 4 to 6 inches in size. And for catfish, it might be up to 8 inches in size. And so when you do this, you want to reduce the number that you stock because these fish are larger. And so you might only put in 250 bluegill per acre, only 50 bass, and only 25 to 50 catfish. But you'll see here that the ratio between bluegill and bass is still the same. So even if you're stocking less, at larger sizes, whatever that is, you can keep this ratio at 5 to 1, and you should end up with pretty balanced populations. And I want to reiterate again that for the most, if you've got an existing pond and you've got some problems with your fish in there, most of the time these problems are not solved by stocking. They're solved by harvest, which we'll talk about in a minute. So once again, these supplemental stockings are really just like if you've had a fish kill, if you need to replace the catfish for some reason or something like that. And once again, if you have specific questions about your pond, feel free to send me an email. I'm more than happy to talk to you about this. And so once you stock the fish into the pond, they'll typically grow pretty well. This depends on the pond, how much food is available, the temperature of your ponds, things like that. But typically, you'll see in the first year, you'll get some pretty decent growth, 2, 3, 4 inches in a year. And you'll see that after 3 years, you'll start catching bass and catfish that are between 10 and 12 inches, and your bluegill should be up to 6 inches or even more by 3 years. Once you've initially stocked the pond, we do recommend waiting, 2 or even 3 years if you can before you start harvesting fish, because that really gives them the opportunity to grow and establish these balanced populations before you start removing any. And like I said, you'll often see bluegill starting to reproduce after their first year, but you might not see any bass spawning until 2 or 3 years after you've stocked them. All right, so I'll stop there for a minute, and next we're going to talk about how we assess the fish we already have in a pond. But are there any questions specifically about fish stocking?
Please put those questions in the chat box for us.
And we'll also have plenty of time at the end to answer questions and have a discussion too.
I'm not seeing anything right at the moment, Mitch.
Yeah, no problem. We'll keep going then. Okay, so I talked about fish assessment last week as part of like monitoring your pond and setting up a plan and stuff like that. And it's a really great idea to try and do this fish assessment every year, because you can really start to get an idea of what your fish populations are doing and what you might need to do to get those goals that you have. But I wanted to go into a little bit more detail about fish assessment today and the sorts of information we want to get and the types of decisions that we can make from it. And so, I mentioned last week that for fish assessment, it can be as basic as going fishing, or, you can use some other methods as well. The key is that when you go fishing or you use these other methods, keep a record of what you catch. Record what species you catch, the size of each of those individuals, and if you can, also record the weight of those individuals. And then also note whether you kept it or whether you released it. And this can start to build a really great data set for assessing your fish. So if you go fishing, once, twice a week throughout the summer, by the end of the summer, you're going to have a really good record of a lot of different fish in your pond that you can start to use to make some decisions. The catch with fishing is that, often we target the larger fish, or we use methods that don't catch small fish or don't catch certain species. And so when we do an assessment of fish, we really want to get a good idea of the variety of the fish that we have. Even if you're only interested in bass, it's still good to understand what the bluegill are doing or something like that. And it's great to catch a whole bunch of 8-inch bluegill, but we also want to get an idea of how many 4-inch bluegill we have in there too. And so you might need to use other methods like dragging a net, which can be a great way to catch some of those smaller fishes. You can contract someone out to come and do an electrofishing assessment of your pond, where they zap the fish, count them, and then release them. There are other things you can do like minnow traps or cast nets and stuff like that. So I always think that if you're really interested in managing your fish and assessing your fish every year, then definitely do some fishing, but it might be worthwhile getting a cast net or a bait net that you can drag through, and a couple of minnow traps. They're pretty inexpensive, and you can really start to get some good data, and it can be a great activity to do with the kids or the grandkids too. So when you go out, you catch these fish, and you're recording information from them. There are two sort of parameters, or two types of things that we want to calculate that can really tell us a lot about that fish population. One of these is called relative weight, and one of these is called proportional size distribution. And I'm going to talk about each of those. To be able to calculate these, the two things that we need to do when we catch a fish is to measure it and to weigh it. So for relative weight, we need the length and the weight of the fish. So you can just have a little handheld scale and a little measuring board that you can take out with you. For proportional size distribution, we only need length. We don't need weight for that one. But if you can get in the habit of recording length at least, or length and weight, then we can start to get some really good fish data. All right, so relative weight, I mentioned this a little bit last week, but basically what relative weight is, it's comparing, it's looking at the condition of your fish. So, we all know that a fish of a certain size should weigh, a certain amount if it's healthy. And basically what we're doing is we're looking at the weight of our fish at a certain length and comparing it to what that weight should be. And then if you do this for a lot of fish, you can start to say, well, are most of my fish underweight or most of them overweight? And you can start to get some information about that growth. And so the way that you do this, it's pretty simple. You go out and you catch a fish. And in this example, we caught a 15-inch, we caught a 15-inch bass, and it weighed 1.5 pounds. And so to calculate what the relative weight of that individual fish is, we go to this table. This table is in our publication, so you can easily find this table. And we look down to find 15 inches here, and we can see that the average weight of a 15-inch bass is 1.8 pounds. And so ours is a little bit lower than that. And so to calculate the relative weight, all we basically do is take the weight that our fish was, divide it by that standard weight, and we'll end up with a percentage. And so this percentage will either be, it could be 100% if it's exactly the same as what the standard weight is. If our weight is lower, it'll be lower than 100%. And if our weight is higher, it'll be higher than 100%. And if you do this for one fish, it doesn't really tell you much. Yes, it can tell you a little bit about that fish, but it doesn't really give you an idea of what your whole population is doing. But if you go out and measure 20 or 30 of your bass, and you calculate this relative weight for all of them, and you see that, well, 90% of them actually are underweight, then that can start to give you an idea of what that population is doing, and you might be able to take some corrective action to get their weight back up. So relative weight is really easy as long as you can record the length and the weight of a fish. And in our publication, we have these relative weight values for bluegill, red-eared sunfish, largemouth bass, and channel catfish. So you can test to see how the growth of your fish are doing against what is standard. I will say that each pond is different, and some ponds are more productive than others. But typically, these weights are standard, and they're also somewhat conservative. So I wouldn't be surprised if you go out and do this and you've got a pretty healthy pond, that you might be seeing your relative weights higher than those standard values. The other thing to keep in mind too is that fish will gain weight differently at certain times of the year. So, bass are there, and most of these fish actually are their heaviest right before they spawn. And so if you measure the weight of a bass, say you catch a 15-inch bass, a female, just before she's going to spawn, she's going to be heavier than after she spawned, because she will have released her eggs. And so it's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at relative weight. The next measure that we can use is proportional size distribution. And basically what we're doing here is we're just getting an idea of the whole population of our fish, and what does that look like. And basically what this means is, if you think about an ideal population, basically you want some small fish, some larger fish, and some really large fish. You want like a diverse population. But if you have, say you have some small fish but no large fish, then that's going to tell you that your population is a little, skewed. And this proportional size distribution is just a numerical way to do that. And so this one doesn't require you to weigh fish, so you don't have to worry about weight. But what it does do is it doesn't actually calculate a number for each fish like relative weight does. You know, with relative weight, you can say, okay, for this fish I caught, it's 85% or whatever. For this measure, what you need to do is go and measure a bunch of fish, and then you'll get one number for that fish population, essentially. And so the way that you do it is you go out and you measure some fish. So in this example, we go out over the space maybe of a week or two, we go out and catch 85 bluegill. And you want to try and catch a good range of sizes, you know, using nets and maybe bobber and worm and stuff like that. And of those 85 bluegill, you measure the length of each of them. And then what you need to do is go and see how many of those bluegill are over different sizes. And so here we basically have two size categories we're interested in: a stock size, which is any fish that are greater than 3 inches, and then a quality size, any fish that are greater than 6 inches. And so, so what we do is we've caught these bluegill. 75 of the 85 were above 3.5 inches, so that we've got that number. And 25 of the 85 were larger than the 6 inches. And so, you know, remember that the 25 that are larger than the 6 inches will also be counted as part of that 75 because they're also larger than 3 inches, which sometimes is a bit confusing if people say, well, the 75 and the 25 don't add up to 85. So basically what you do is you look at all your fish, you see how many of them are above 3 inches, and you go, okay, that's one number. And then you look at all your fish again, how many are above 6 inches. So that's how you calculate those two numbers. And then what you do is then to calculate this PSD, you divide the number of fish in the quality size divided by the number of fish in the stock size. So here it's 25 divided by 75, which is about 33. Now, you know, you're like, okay, well, what does that tell me? You know, that doesn't mean anything to me. But basically there are recommended ranges for this PSD value for each of these fish. And you can see that for bluegill, the recommended range is between 20 to 60. And you can see the different values here. And so basically what this number means is that if you have a really low number, so say your number is 10, that means that you've got very few quality size fish compared to the rest of the fish there. If your number is 100, then that means all of your fish are really large and you don't have any small fish. So you don't want a really small number, and you actually don't want a really large number either. You want those middle values that say, well, yes, I've got some small fish, but I've also got some large fish. And so, you know, this is a pretty big range, and this will vary a lot depending on the pond and even depending on the year to year. But this is just a nice way you can do that. You can check to see if you're within that range. And the other thing you can do is if you do this once every year, over the few years, you can actually track this number you're getting. And if that number is going up or going down, you may change some of your management. So what do we do with this information? Well, I've mentioned this a bit already, but basically for relative weight, if you have a low relative weight, that means that your fish growth is suboptimal. So that means that, okay, your fish are getting to 15 inches, but they are not as heavy as they should be. And sometimes this can be from low food availability, low productivity on your pond. Sometimes it can be because of disease or something like that. But there can be a food availability element to this. And this is particularly the case if you have really clear ponds with low nutrients. But for the most part, this happens not because there's not enough food available in your pond, but because there are too many mouths to feed. And so this can happen because you might have too many bass in your pond. They're competing with each other for food. And so each of them are not getting enough food. It's not that there's not enough food in your pond, but you've just got too many bass in there to feed. So that's what that relative weight value can indicate. The PSD value can also tell you, well, what are your fish sort of in balance in that population? Do you have some small fish, some medium fish, some large fish? And like I said, it's these middle range values sort of indicate that you have a pretty well-rounded population. If you have really low numbers, then that means you've got lots and lots of little fish, but no big fish. And typically what this means is, once again, you've got crowding and overpopulation of fish. You've got all these little fish in there. There's no space and there's not enough food available for those fish to grow larger. If you have really, really high numbers, like 100, which means all your fish are large, then that usually indicates you have bad reproduction. So you've got all these large fish, they try and reproduce, they might not have appropriate habitat or substrate, but even if they do reproduce and lay eggs, maybe there are things eating those eggs or eating those small fish before they can get large. So they're the sorts of things that those two values can tell you. And the great news is, unlike problem fish, which can be really difficult to deal with, if you have population imbalances in the fish you want there, say you have bad growth or stunted fish, these are actually relatively easy to solve. And the way that we solve that is with fish harvest. So before I get into fish harvest, have we got any questions?
Mitch, Sarah's asking, and I'm assuming this is about, feeding the fish or the growth rate. Can neighbors feeding bread weekly to fish in the neighborhood pond affect this?
That's a good question. And I get, questions about fish feeding all the time. Sometimes fish feeding can help, or feeding your fish can help. But it's really only going to help if you have a pond that's low in production. And so an example I've used before is that if you have a pretty clear pond, it's not getting a lot of nutrients running into it, it doesn't have a lot of algae growing. And so that means that there's just lower production in that pond. There's not enough food for the bluegill. There's not enough bluegill then for the bass. And so in that situation, you can directly feed the fish, like you can throw pellets in for the bluegill. That'll help them grow and reproduce better and then provide more food for the bass. Or you could potentially add fertilizer to the pond that grows more algae, that then feeds the bluegill, that then feeds the bass. I would say that there's probably only 3 to 5% of scenarios in the Midwest where that is the case. Most Midwestern ponds already have enough nutrients in them to fuel good fish growth. And if you add food or if you add fertilizer, then that can just make those problems worse. The exception to this is if you're interested in growing really large bass or really large bluegill, like a trophy pond, which we'll talk about here in a minute, then adding some food can help in some circumstances. I will say that if you are going to add food to a pond to try and promote fish growth, it's probably best to get like a specific fish food, because these are formulated to be most efficient and provide the best nutrition for fish and can really get the most out of their growth. If you're feeding them other things like bread, then what will happen is not a lot of that energy is being used by the fish because it's not very efficient. You might end up with a lot of fish poop or whatever, and it may not be the best way to sort of get that growth. So if it's kids throwing bread in occasionally to feed the fish, that's not a big deal. But if you're trying to use that as a strategy to improve growth, it's probably not going to be as effective as using specific food. Okay, so I want to talk now about management and harvest. So this is sort of the last section we're going to talk about today. And when you are putting fish in your pond and you're thinking about having fish in your pond to catch and to eat, there are a few different options you can choose. These are a few options that we recommend, and there are others if there are more specific and unique options, and you can work with consultants to help get those. But these are just some of the ones I'm going to talk about today. So and I guess the other thing to think about too when you're thinking about what sort of fish populations do I want, you also need to think about the amount of effort you want to put into management of those fish. If you know that you don't have much time to put into managing and monitoring those fish, then you might choose one of these options that requires lower effort. If you choose one that requires high effort and you don't have the time to put that effort in, then you can end up with unbalanced populations. So that's always an important thing to think about. But the 4 options that we recommend, the first one of those is having a catfish only pond. So if you have a small pond, 1/3 of an acre, 1/4 of an acre, something like that, and you also don't have a lot of time to monitor whether all your fish are in balance, you have enough bluegill for food and bass for predators and all that sort of stuff, then just having catfish in a pond can be a great option. They'll eat some of the natural food in the pond, some of the vegetation, some of the invertebrates. You can also add some pelleted fish food to help feed them as well. And the great thing about a catfish only pond is it's really like a put the fish in, grow them up, and take them out. You don't have to worry about keeping things in balance. All you need to do is, yeah, you put a certain amount in based on the size of your pond, and each year you might, pull some out to eat, and then and the rest can grow, and they should be able to reproduce pretty good because there are no predators in there. And so this can be a really low effort option if you're just looking to have some fish in your pond. The second option, and the option that most people want, is what we call an all-purpose pond. So this is where you might have 2, 3, or 4 species in your pond, and you want to have some good fishing for food. You want to have some reasonably sized bluegill, some good sized bass, some catfish. You can catch fish for sport, you can catch fish for food, and really just provides a general sort of all-round pond. These require more management because basically the more species you put in your pond, the more difficult it is to keep all of those in balance. Because once they start eating each other, you need to manage, you need to have both good bluegill and good bass populations for them to be in balance with each other. So it becomes more tricky in that sense. But if you use the assessment and monitoring techniques that we've spoken about, and you follow some of these harvesting guidelines, you can still manage these ponds so that they stay in balance and can provide general good fishing opportunities. Then two sort of more common options that some people want, these are more specific and they require more effort, is that sometimes people want a pond to just grow trophy sunfish. They want to grow bluegill that are 10 inches or more and red ear that are 15 inches or more. And there are some specific things you need to do to be able to do that. And when you do that, you may find that the bass in your pond are quite small because you need a lot of bass in there to help with predation on bluegill. And so you sort of have a trade-off. You might not get really good bass fishing, but you get great sunfish fishing. And then the flip side is true for if you want to grow trophy bass. If you want to grow trophy bass, then typically you need lots and lots of sunfish to feed them. And that means that your sunfish are going to be overcrowded and probably not grow very large, but they do provide great food for the bass. And so, so these are the options where you're more interested in one or other species, but there's a trade-off in that you might lose good fishing for some of the other species in your pond. And these can also take a bit more management. You really need to keep keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with your fish populations and change your harvesting strategies to keep in line with these goals. So I've mentioned harvest quite a bit today, and that's because harvest is the best tool that we have to manage fish. Like I said, we can't, we put fish in there, we try and create this balanced population from when we stock fish, but those populations are not going to stay in balance unless we actively harvest them and manage them. And the reason we need to harvest fish is because we need to remove fish out of that pond to provide space for new fish to grow. If we just put fish in there and let them reproduce and don't take any out from the other end, then they're going to get overcrowded and they're all going to end up, really small. So harvest is great. A lot of people, don't want to harvest fish because they sort of almost see them a little bit like their pets, or in particular, they might want to, catch and release bass because that's what we do when we go fishing in lakes and reservoirs. But pretty much any fish that you have in your pond, you should be harvesting some of those each year so that you free up space for others to grow. We have this table here that basically provides some harvest guidelines for fish, depending on what management scenario you're working towards. So if you have a catfish only pond and you're providing those catfish with good food, there's no reason why you can't harvest, up to 30 fish each year without having any impact on those populations. And then with some of these other scenarios, you can see how fish harvest might change between some of these scenarios. And so typically you'll see that we want to harvest quite a lot of sunfish out of our pond, between 150 and 300 individuals per acre each year, which is a lot. And it can take take quite a bit to do that. And so you might need to, invite some friends around, get the, neighborhood kids around to have a little fishing derby, have a fish fry. But over the space of a year, you should be aiming to harvest those out, because sunfish are the ones that are most commonly overcrowded and stunted. And so that's really what, harvesting those sunfish is really the best way to prevent that from happening. We should also be harvesting bass. And, a lot of people, like I said, don't want to harvest bass because they think of them more as catch and release. But bass are pretty good to eat, and we want to harvest them so that we can help the bass that are in our pond grow large. If we don't harvest bass, then what you'll end up with is a bunch of 12-inch bass in your pond, and they don't really grow any larger than that. And so by harvesting some of those 12 inches out of your pond, you free up the space, and then the ones that are left can grow to 15, 18 inches or even larger. And we can talk more about some of these guidelines if you have specific questions for your pond. The guidelines for the channel catfish stay the same depending on the management option, because like I said, they don't really impact that predator-prey relationship very much. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about now, I think this is my last slide, is just an example of how we can use harvest to fix problems. So like I said, we want harvest as part of our ongoing management plan because we want to regularly be freeing up space for those other fish to grow. And the bonus is that we get to go fishing and we get to eat some of the fish that we catch. But if, let's say, you have a pond that hasn't had fish harvest in a while, or you've noticed that you've got some issues with your fish populations, then harvest is the tool that we use to try and fix those issues. And so this is just an example of some of the different scenarios you might get. So, you might see that your bass are less than 12 inches, but your bluegill are really large. So what do you do to rectify that problem? And so I'm going to just step through one of these examples, and this is probably the example that I see the most when people come to me with problems with their fish. And that is where you go out and you've been monitoring the fish that you're catching, and you find that most of the bass that you catch are less than 12 inches. You can catch a lot of them, but they're all 12 inches or less. And likewise, there are a lot of bluegill in your pond. You see them swimming around a lot. You catch a lot of them, but you don't really catch any big ones. They're all less than 5 inches. And what this tells me is that you have an overcrowded pond. You have lots of fish in there, but they don't have the space or the food available to grow large. And so for this situation, what we would recommend is you absolutely need to increase the harvest of your bluegill, because this will remove them out and allow some of those ones that are left to grow larger. If you have a lot of 4 and 5 inch bluegill, they might be too small to eat, and so you might actually just need to harvest them and discard them. But you absolutely need to harvest some of those out. I would also recommend in this scenario to harvest some of the bass. It says here, do not harvest bass. The thought behind that is you will harvest some of these bluegill, you'll free up some space, and then some of the 12-inch bass you have will eat some of the remaining bluegill and actually grow larger as well. But I would actually recommend you to harvest some of the bass in this scenario as well, because it seems like they're also overcrowded. And then by freeing up space for both of these populations, you then should see that growth improve. They're great. This might feel like a frustrating situation because you have all these fish in there, but you don't have any large fish. But what's great about this scenario is that you've got a really good base of fish in your pond, and you just need to pull some of those out to provide the space for the fish that are left to grow larger. And I always tell people that over harvest is a lot less problematic than under harvest. If you go out there and you get really, motivated to harvest your fish, and you go out and you're removing, 1,000 bluegill or, 50, 60 bass, then you may reduce the population so much that they become less abundant. But the good news is that they'll have incredible growth over the next year or two because there's so much free space. And so over harvest is nowhere near as bad as under harvest, because under harvest leads to this situation where you have lots of fish and none of them grow very large. All right, so that's it for my presentation today. I think we've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm more than happy to have a discussion, answer anybody's questions, and go from there.
Mitch, thank you so much. That was really informative. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for now. This will be posted on YouTube for everyone to reference, but I will stop now, and then we'll have a more informal discussion together. Thank you.